I've always had this romantic view of travel where you go looking for the exotic paradise somewhere far away. Kashmir and Xanadu. That's really the model for the distant paradise, the stately pleasure dome that people aspire to one day reach. But then I learned that the poet Coleridge had read William Bartram's travels about his experiences in this part of Florida. So in fact, it was this area that people found so exotic. It was our rivers and springs. It was our aquifer running underground that inspired the river Alps and waters measureless to man down to a sunless sea. It was Payne's Prairie. It was the St. Johns River, Silver Springs, and the Ocklawaha. This really was the last frontier. It wasn't out west. It was the wild and humid swamps of Florida where travelers would tap into that beating pulse of our aquifer. The exotic is here. I'm in it. It's right in my backyard. For years, I've spoken with people who yearn to see Cannon Springs during a drawdown. They've had this dream, and now they've come here during this drawdown for this pilgrimage, this journey, seeing what Cannon Springs could be and what it was less than half a century ago when it flowed into a free-flowing Ocklawaha River. During the drawdown, we only have 4 or 5 months to see the springs. And after that, the gates are closed, the water starts backing up again. It hides the river's historic channel. It smothers all the springs and that vast landscape that was just starting to grow again. For Captain Erica, who grew up here, it must be so incredibly painful to recall the total devastation of this river. For most of her life, this place has never healed. It's a kind of environmental genocide that she's had to experience firsthand, over and over again.
My great-great-grandfather settled here, close to the Ocklawaha River. It was the highway, it was where everybody was. You had a source of food, transportation. A lot of us just clung to this beautiful area. I learned to fish out there off an old logging skidder. I started fishing when I was 3. I just bugged them until they handed me a cane pole and let me fish. And first thing I did was swat Mom right off the barge right into a deep hole in the river. I thought I was in deep trouble, but they were laughing at her so much because she didn't even get her hair wet, so I still get to fish. They cut down a huge cypress tree. My mom would sit on that stump and watch the big bucket of the crane coming through the trees, and then the next step there would be no trees. They had piles of stuff burning as they cleared it. to watch them take out some of the most prettiest parts of the swamp where there was some springs, and to go right through Indian Mountains like they didn't matter. She grew up along the river, and she would take me and my little sister in diapers and my older sister, and we would go out. Every weekend we went out in the woods, and she was pointing out trees. She was pointing out, look at this and remember this. They had already planned every 10 years that they'd have to do these maintenance drawdowns. Then it became every 5 years, and then it was 3 years. They have to drain her down to flush out all this material that's accumulated from dying masses of plants. The Ocklawaha River has had many insults by people, but when they put a dam across her, it was just like putting your foot across her throat, choking her down. Then to walk away and leave her with something across her throat she couldn't breathe.
There's probably nothing like the drowned forest on Earth. It's more bizarre than you could ever imagine. Before I ever saw it, I tried to imagine what it was like. I couldn't. And now I can't unsee it. It's this frozen moment of horror. Decade after decade, it stays as devastating and as terrible as the day it happened. All these trees are dead, and eerily, they are all broken off at the very same height. It's heartbreaking if you have any sympathy for trees and forests and what they provide for us.
Ladies and gentlemen, it pleases me to report to the people of Florida and the nation that the long-sought Cross-Florida Barge Canal is now well underway. Construction at both ends of the 107-mile protected inland waterway artery has been progressing for many months. Its recreational and flood control potential rivals its economic possibilities. Briefly, the canal will create 285 miles of new shoreline in Florida and approximately 30,000 more acres of surface water behind 2 dams that's included in the overall construction.
The canal is designed to cross the state at the most advantageous place geologically, elevation-wise and groundwater-wise. It will utilize a series of locks, and the barges will be lifted up by these locks in a series of steps and will be floated across the summit area and lowered by a lock at Silver Springs, at Eureka, at St. John's into the St. John's River. We of the Division of Geology are convinced that our water resources can be controlled and managed through the construction of the barge canal, and no damage will result to these resources.
I want to commend the Florida Canal Authority. Such planning ahead for the conservation, tree farming, and recreational uses will also help slow down the eutrophication or natural aging of the bodies of water created behind these various locks and dams. The ultimate fate of any such body of water is to fill in or silt in. And the lowering of the reservoir water level periodically will delay this very slow aging process indefinitely, slowing eutrophication. Now, such lowering of these reservoirs has been recommended and will be implemented by the Corps of Engineers. It will help save the trees and will result in improved fishing and duck populations that will benefit these areas.
Manatee, sturgeon, huge black schools of catfish, bears and deer and alligator. This was their Eden. This was the passageway for creation.
Florida springs are what's magic about Florida. It's the reason I moved here back in '97, just to be able to explore these lost springs and to see something that should be bubbling and available for all. I'm giddy with excitement, but at the same time, it's bittersweet to know that these springs are going to be inundated with too much water just to maintain this artificial ecosystem. The benefits of a free-flowing Ocklawaha and the 20 springs or more that are buried beneath the pool when it's up is well documented. And when you look at this ecosystem, you have to look at the Ocklawaha, the St. Johns, and Silver River all together. But what happens when you free these springs, allow them to flow in, the water quality of the Ocklawaha improves. You have 15,000 acres of forested floodplain that will come back into its natural state instead of getting too much water or too little water. And all of that will improve the water quality of the St. Johns. It'll help push back saltwater intrusion, as well as it could open up those important migratory fish patterns back into the Ocklawaha and all the way to Silver Spring. So it helps water quality, it helps habitat restoration. To actually see it free-flowing is going to be quite an experience to see the science come back to life.
It's inevitable that these springs will be released. It's inevitable that this Rodman Pool will go away. Of course, I get the aesthetic pleasure of visiting springs just like everybody else does. I don't look at them just as dryly from a scientific standpoint, but I do appreciate the complexity of them and the individuality of them. And here's these ones that are being released for this short period of time. We can enjoy them, but think of all the people that were here before us for 15,000 years, using them as their water supply, bathing in them, getting food from them, and we've killed them, at least temporarily. We've developed this land to such an extent and extracted its water resources to such an extent and polluted them that we're literally watching the death of these springs. For me as a scientist, I have to document that death. I feel terrible about it. I feel terrible when I go to these springs and see that they're not productive anymore, that they don't have the fish that they had in them once, that the water's polluted, that there's less of the water. These springs, and all the springs in North Florida, can be restored in less than 100 years. In less than 50 years, we could restore these springs. I'm glad that people can see that springs can come and go because it tells you that they can be reborn.
These springs are popping up, and this very limited number of people are aware of it and going to see and revel in these springs and really appreciate them. But this thing is going to be just like a blink of an eye. This blue eye is blinking and then shutting again with the reservoir. There's really been no strong reconnection with the springs. There's obviously a lot of people who love them and come to know them, and generations of people in some instances, but on a cultural level, many people don't even know we have springs literally in Florida. And much more of them have never seen one. And I think that sort of speaks to the real heart of the issue of trying to protect them and the water in general, is that loss of a connection, a loss of just a deep, deep, ancient cultural connection. Our stories in our society go back a couple hundred years, and that's exceptional. People who have family go back several generations, that's pretty rare in Florida. But even for them, you ask somebody what a sacred river is, name a sacred river, you're not going to hear anybody in the state say Ocklawaha. We just don't have that kind of heartfelt connection in the state. It's tragic that these springs are not better known by the general public of Florida. These are definitely the lost springs, and in some ways, many of our springs are the lost springs just because they're no longer part of our general sense of connection to the land. You can imagine what it must have been like for people 14,000 years ago that first came into Florida. A much drier, cooler place at that time at the end of the ice ages. A lot of these springs weren't even flowing yet, so they were just these pools with deep water that probably developed some mythology around them and whole creation myths and stories behind all these standing pools. Those people had probably been here several thousand years when the water table finally got up close to where it is now and began to overflow the land. You can just sort of imagine how that must have impacted them and their culture and their stories. For people who didn't grow up with some familial or cultural connection, springs do that on their own. You take somebody to a spring and it speaks to people. There's something very magical, very aesthetic and beautiful about the springs that touches people sort of in a spiritual way. Found over the years, I take people to these springs and they have experiences that are more than aesthetic, let's just put it that way. You can tell people are really moved by seeing this water coming out of the earth.
The springs spend more and more time coughing up all the sand and mud from years of decomposing vegetation. And then, when they're finally coming into their true and right space, the drawdown's over, the stagnant water comes back. We have this short drawdown, and then it's over. Then they're gone. The springs are gone until who knows when. Maybe they're gone forever.
What the Akawaha and the Silver River, Silver Springs, St. John's River, what this meant to people who lived here at the turn of the 20th century. First of all, you have to realize at the beginning of the 20th century, fewer than 1 million people lived in Florida. So this was the least populous state east of the Mississippi River. So very few people, and yet this was in many ways the beginning of Florida tourism. people came here, the great thinkers, Thomas Edison, Henry Ford, Harriet Beecher Stowe, were fascinated with the so-called real Florida or the old Florida. And they would cram onto these steamboats and make their way down the Ocklawaha, even at night with these great fires on the boat. It was an experience. This is what people came from around the nation and around the world to do, to get on these steamboats and marvel at the subtropical wilderness of Florida.
I always feel a very strong sense of connection with other artists who long ago came to the same place that we walked and worked. It gives me a sense of community, sense of camaraderie. So I love thinking of Frank Hamilton Taylor traveling up the Ocklawaha River more than a century ago and illustrating this journey he took with former President Ulysses S. Grant. Taylor was from the Northeast, so this experience in Florida had to be quite the shock to him to see such an amazing and wild landscape. Back then, it would have been like going up to Amazon. It was the wild jumping off place, the torrid zone, this fertile paradise where strange things happen. They seem to see Florida for what it is back then. Nowadays, we forget this about Florida. We try to make Florida like other more normal places. But they knew that it wasn't normal, that there was a sense of innocence and health that was found here. This was a place where everyone came to find their dreams.
Going down today on the boat, you could really put yourself back in that time 100 years ago and more than 100 years ago because there were gators everywhere today. We were doing the same thing. We were marveling at nature from a more modern boat, doing exactly what humans were doing here a century and a half ago through nature, ecotourism without the word. This is key to understanding the Florida of the past and the Florida of the future. Where are we going to continue to value these places? These bodies of water, this part of nature that is relatively unchanged from what it was more than a century ago, except that we have this dam. It would be so simple to allow nature to take its course and more generations of people would come here and enjoy the river.
Historical elements of this river are part of what are really so compelling with it. You have the strong Native American elements to it. The Timucua that were up in here were part of a much bigger confederation. The Timucua were all over North Florida, but in the upper Ocklawaha was the Aquera. They really resisted the Europeans. They really held their own in here for a long time, more than a lot of the Native American tribes were able to. For a long time, the Spanish called this the Rinconada, which meant like the hidden place, or the hidden area.
There's so much history here, all the indigenous sites all along the river, and it would be nice to be able to honor their existence. People could go out and paddle right along where those sites are. It's like a time capsule. If it was restored, I think it would be a real eye-opener to what's going on in this area throughout history. It's all right there to be studied, unless the water's up, and then it's not accessible. To realize what's here and care about it and realize we're all part of this system too. And we depend on the health of this system just like the birds and the alligators and everything else. Our resources are supposed to be protected. Article 2, Section 7 in the Florida Constitution mentions that we have a right to clean water, not just the quality and quantity, but the beautiful areas are supposed to be protected. Article 2, Section 7. To come through here in this natural system, it's an incredible experience, and people want to do that. Both counties are losing tourism dollars. Palatka is trying to promote ecotourism. Silver Springs, they're trying to promote ecotourism. If you could go through the Ocklawaha like you used to be able to, you could go all the way out to the St. John's. You can't do that. The dam is in the way. Having this reconnected so people can go through, so that whole area that's drowned out can grow back into a beautiful system like this. This is what people want to see when they come out. When it's clear and blue, it's just magical. When you get to these springs, you look down in, it's like looking into the heart of the earth, and the veins are just pumping out this clear water. It seems like people have some innate understanding of that's where life comes from, that clean water. People would come from all over to see this, because they do. During the drawdown, they do.
construction was from 1964 to 1971, when it was halted by both Richard Nixon, a presidential order, and also by U.S. federal court decision. What was left was the dam and its attendant reservoir still on the Ocklawaha. It wasn't just environmentalists who were opposed to it. It was rock-ribbed conservatives who saw government money being thrown away on a project that was completely useless. The moment was amazing. If it had been started 5 years earlier, it would have been completed. I think it had been started 5 years later, it would have been completed. There was just this moment in time with Earth Day, with the environmental movement, when incredibly the environmental movement was bipartisan. Mainstream magazines like Sports Illustrated and Reader's Digest had articles on environmental stuff. Reader's Digest had an article called Rape on the Ocklawaha, this lurid title, and it was about the fact that this river valley was being destroyed. But it was also about the fact that tax dollars were being wasted. The level of citizen activism in Gainesville, in Marion County, I think is profoundly important in making sure that this thing was stopped. Everybody in the state, from governors to state politicians to the federal government to that incredible bureaucracy of the Army Corps of Engineers, I mean, they were all on board to finishing this thing, and citizens stopped it. If they can do that, they can also do this. The opportunity for other citizen activists to come around and continue what happened with them stopping the canal allows me to maybe have some hope that these people will force the hand of the powers that be to allow the reservoir to be drained, allow other people to see these springs, and to preserve and protect not just the ones that were saved when the canal was stopped, but to preserve and protect the ones that were destroyed when the remnants of the canal were allowed to remain.
Cannon Springs was one of the main driving forces to stopping the Cross Florida Barge Canal. The Kaus family lived up here. While the construction was starting, they heard a commotion and came down here, and they saw this monster machine, the crusher crawler, that was stomping a gridwork of paths back and forth through the entire floodplain. And lo and behold, it hit right into the middle of this spring and was just chomping it and crushing it.
Thinking about a family that has been uprooted by this ridiculous project is really powerful. And then to see these beautiful springs and know they're about to be flooded again is really morbid and horrifying at the same time that it's beautiful. And to come out here and experience it, I would think that anyone who had no experience at all with the issue, the Ocklawaha restoration and the Cross Florida Barge Canal, would be moved by what they see. There's something about getting out into these places, these magical, mystical places like Cannon Springs, and interacting with nature that crosses political boundaries. I think there's something to be said for experiencing this, swimming around, looking at it, touching it, thinking about it.
There are so many people who share an enthusiasm for seeing the springs during the drawdown. And there are many people involved with the Ocklawaha and getting it restored. These pilgrims, they are all about this place and this event of a drawdown. This is it. They're the wise men or women. They've come from a long way to see it. They've had it almost foretold in prophecy. For years, they've talked about seeing these waters in this spring. Kayakers and tourists, curious people, they've prepared for weeks, they've come great distances, and everybody, once they get here, cannot stay away from the water. They are drawn like a moth to a flame. You forget. It's like inspiration or a state of grace. You forget what the springs are like, what it's like to be underwater and in them. So you have to keep returning because they're so unbelievable. And yet, there they are, something that would only seem to exist in your dreams. people must have had that same reaction here at Cannon Springs, like they're entering a sacred space. People gathered around this spring 50 years ago knowing that the barge canal would smash right through it. And this is the place where they said, this is enough. This is where they started to fight back against it. And so to see Cannon Springs covered up with the brown water and sludge, drowning under that Rodman impoundment, it's absolutely devastating. It's not like I can script these experiences. I can't implement an agenda for how a painting should look. If I do, the springs is not truly present in the work. It's just a hollow reference point, just a point of departure. I need to be open to what I see, not to what I think something is. I'm a witness, and I'm a vessel for all I experience here. So when something has changed in the way the springs are, I notice it. It filters in. Your intuition and subconscious might later show you something you hadn't noticed. The Kirkpatrick Dam casts a dark shadow on Cannon Springs. It's as much a part of this painting as it's the spring. It affects the colors and the movement and the energy. The painting would not be complete without that weight of the shellac on top of it. And yet after I did it, it bothered me for days. It felt horrible to be part of covering this spring, even my representation of it. I felt like I was somehow making the end of the drawdown real, and I was pulling these millions of gallons of stagnant water back on top of the springs myself. There's truth in the brown of the shellac, but there's also truth in these new colors buried deep within the aquifer waiting to come back. My choice is in this splash of blue and this flash of green. In those colors, I'll honor the prism of light and color that is this beautiful spring. I'll send out that call to wonder and discovery to other pilgrims and celebrate a new future for this river. This is my action. I am certain that one day soon, that dam will be breached, and this river and its springs will be set free, and a tumultuous and shining rainbow of colors will return for good to Cannon Springs.